Michael D. Higgins took a break from campaigning for his own re-election in the Republic to visit Derry and commemorate what he called one of the most important events in the island's history.
Forgiveness is a cornerstone in our construction of hope, but it must be a forgiveness informed by understanding of the importance of accepting difference. And in achieving that, I have suggested, amnesia is of no value to us.
All weekend, events in Duke Street in 1968 have been retold. For some, it was a spark in the fight for equal rights and opportunities. Others are more sceptical. Most agree it marked the start of the Troubles here. Earlier, Pat Hume had arrived representing her husband John, notable by his absence due to ill health. She won a standing ovation. Her husband a tribute from the podium.
Sometimes I fear, and I know this fear is quite widely held, that the contribution of John Hume and his dogged persistence on the possibilities of dialogue through the dark twilight years of the Trouble might be eclipsed. Not only would that be a distortion of history, it would be unjust.
I think the people of this city and the people of this country and this island understand very well the contribution of John Hume, and he'll always be thanked and remembered and thought of in a different way than some of the people who are trying to do that.
Veteran campaigner and SDLP co-founder Ivan Cooper was recognised for his lifetime contribution, but he said he too was sorry his friend John Hume couldn't be here. Others would have liked to see more Unionist faces in the audience.
I could understand if some Unionists would be slightly self-conscious about coming here, but I suppose I've been around enough corners. I'm not as self-conscious as that.
Declan Harvey reporting from Derry. Colum Eastwood and Jim Nicholson are still with me, as are Paul McFadden and Graham Gudgin. Colum Eastwood, just first of all, most people agree that march 50 years ago in Derry was the start of a radical new phase in Northern Ireland's history. But 5 decades on, there's still no agreed narrative on civil rights. Why do you think that is?
Well, the civil rights movement was a collection of people from all different parts and all different ideologies who came together to do one thing, to change society, to give people economic opportunity, to give people democratic rights, to give people access to housing and access to jobs. And they came together and they did it in a peaceful way. They chose the path of protest and the path of politics. And I think what the argument you hear now, and I think people are a bit tired of the argument, one side trying to claim legacy against the other. And really what I think it was about was it's a battle between people who chose the path of politics and people who chose the path of violence. Ultimately, politics won. Unfortunately, it took far too long and cost far too many lives.
Some Unionists think that the narrative over the past 50 years, but particularly over the past few days, has been very one-sided and not entirely historically accurate. Do they have a point?
Well, I don't know what the point is. If the point is that many working class Protestants equally didn't have access to power, equally didn't have access to economic opportunity, well, that's totally true. And if you look at the aims of the civil rights movement, they were standing up for those people as well. This wasn't, although there were many people who were nationalist or Republican or socialist or communist involved in the civil rights movement, it wasn't a one-sided argument. It was about giving everybody, empowering everybody to have full economic rights and full civil rights. And we still don't have that, by the way, because if you look at the city that I'm sitting in today, we still have the highest levels of unemployment, we still have the highest levels of economic inactivity, and we still haven't expanded McGee University, a campaign that started even before the civil rights movement. And we had 10 years of unbroken DUP Sinn Féin controlled government, and they didn't address any of those issues. So those issues are still here today, and we can't get access to the power that we've been given to try to do something about it.
OK, Graham Gudgin, you have argued that the history, the telling of civil rights has been oversimplified, I think. Why do you believe that's the case?
Oh, it absolutely has, and been exaggerated in a dangerous way in many ways. I mean, I'm a statistician and an economist. I just look at the facts. And when I investigated this, you find, for instance, at the end of the Stormont regime, 1971, these are official census figures, Catholics were overrepresented in state-owned houses, not underrepresented. Colum seems to be smiling about this, but he can look at the census like...
Well, the
incident
that sparked all of this was Caledon
yes.
In 1968. Caledon happened, and it did appear to be a case of discrimination.
You accept that? It was, yes. I think that there was discrimination over the allocation of houses for gerrymandering reasons in about 6 of the 68 local authorities in Northern Ireland. That was a real problem. I think the councillors involved should have been banned from public life. They should have been fined. But what happens in Northern Ireland? We have 30 years of violence instead. But the background facts are still there. Overall, Catholics were overrepresented in housing, and the most authoritative investigation done in the 1960s by Professor Richard Rose, an American from Glasgow University, was that the main problem was discrimination against Protestants in Catholic areas. Who knows that nowadays? You know, it's been suppressed. Okay, sort of thing we really ought to know.
I'll come back to Colum Eastwood in a moment or two. Paul, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I remember. I'll throw a statistic into it. I remember talking to the late Bishop Edward Daly, who was when he arrived in Derry as a curate at St Eugene's Cathedral, talked about being appalled at discovering that in one house in Nelson Street in the Bogside, there were 29 people living in a single 2-bedroom house. 29 people from 4 different families. That says that there was something wrong. Now, it's been one of the sort of privileges of my sort of recent life to meet people from the Unionist community, working class, loyalist women who would describe living in conditions of deprivation that do mirror those of people on the in the nationalist side of the community, if we put it that way. What those people, those women now regret is that they didn't maybe embrace the civil rights movement, because their feeling was that at that time they were very ill-served by the political powers that existed in Northern Ireland.
Let me ask Jim Nicholson about this. Do you think some Unionists have got it wrong in their understanding of what happened in 1968 and why the civil rights movement emerged in the way that it did? I mean, if there wasn't a fundamental problem, why did the Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill, at the time, table a 5-point plan to try to actually tackle some of the difficulties that he identified on the ground?
Well, there's a lot of questions in that, Mark, and I can't... Terence O'Neill made his famous speech about Ulster being at the crossroads. And I think as one looks back on life and all our lives, we can see where things could have been done differently.
But should things have been done differently in 1968? Was there a problem? Just quickly, do you accept there was a problem that needed to be addressed?
I do not accept, and I think a lot of Unionists believed that was a move to topple Stormont, as it eventually did, and we have seen what's happened. And I have to say to you, for the 40 years and the 50 years, it's 50 years ago now, from the 40 years of terrorism we had in this province, I have to say, and the vast number of Unionists would believe that was not worth it.
Okay, let me just come back, Colum Eastwood. Colum Eastwood, the charge there from Graham Gudgin and from Jim Nicholson is that what happened was A, politically motivated, and B, the trouble on the ground or the issues on the ground were exaggerated. That's what Graham Gudgin says.
Well, total and utter nonsense. Of course they were politically motivated. They were motivated to get people out of poverty. They were motivated to make sure that everybody had a vote.
And when they had
that vote, that their vote counted the same as anybody else in the city. The idea that you can deny the fact that the old Derry Corporation, for example, wasn't gerrymandered in such a way to discriminate against Catholics. Of course, working class Protestants were discriminated against as well, and it was their own leaders who served them extremely badly. Of course, the Stormont government needed to be toppled. It was a disgrace. It was a corrupt regime who discriminated against half of the population. Just look look at what happened in the building of motorways. Just look at what happened in the building of the university.
I want to go back to Graham Gudgin very quickly.
That is the history of this place, and thank God it is not there anymore. We had the opportunity, by the way, to fix all of that after the Sunningdale Agreement, and both the Ulster Workers' Council and the IRA tried to destroy that. It took us 25 years to get back to it.
Graham Gudgin, just in a couple of words, if you would, Terence O'Neill put forward a 5-point plan to deal with unfairness on the ground. Why did he do that if things weren't unfair?
Well, there was unfairness, as I've said, in 6 local authority areas, including Derry, London, Derry. But overall, there wasn't unfairness. And I've said houses were built for Catholic. They were overrepresented. Colum can look at the census like anybody else.
Because they needed them, because they didn't have any jobs.
All right, OK. Look, I think we could continue this conversation very happily into the middle of the afternoon, but we don't have time for that. Thank you all very much indeed.